in the dark depths of our modern cities, hide mysteries that our rational minds refuse to accept. Enigmas that defy logic and remind us that reality can sometimes be far more terrifying than our worst nightmares. Thomas Delacroix had just signed the lease for his new apartment, a small 2-bedroom on the 5th floor of a dilapidated building in the Belleville district. The real estate agent had insisted on the authentic character of the building constructed in 1923, with its thick walls and old-world charm. The rent was surprisingly affordable for Paris, a detail that should have alerted Thomas, but only reinforced his satisfaction at having found a rare gem in this ruthless real estate market. The dark hallways of the building gave off a musty smell mixed with cheap disinfectant, a characteristic fragrance of working-class housing that had survived decades. Now, Mr. Garnier, the elderly concierge, had welcomed him with distant politeness, his tired eyes scrutinizing the new tenant as if seeking to penetrate his intentions. The first evening in his new apartment, Thomas settled in front of his television with a feeling of deep satisfaction. Finally, he had his own space, away from the suffocating shared housing he had just left and the endless arguments with his former roommates. The second-hand furniture he had assembled gave the apartment a mismatched but warm appearance. Around 23 hours, as he was preparing to go to bed, a strange murmur crossed the partition that separated his living room from the neighboring apartment. At first, Thomas thought it was simply a neighbor watching television or talking on the phone. A classic noise nuisance of apartment building life, but as the minutes passed, he realized that these persistent murmurs had something unusual about them. They resembled neither a telephone conversation nor television dialogues, rather a monotonous litany pronounced in a deep and cavernous voice. Thomas pressed his ear against the cold wall, trying to distinguish the words that were lost in the thickness of the partition. The sounds reached him muffled, as if filtered through several layers of matter, but their haunting character was undeniable. Tired by his moving day, he finally fell asleep, promising himself to introduce himself to his neighbor the next day to establish good neighbor rules. The second day, Tom met Madame Petty, a frail old lady who lived in the apartment. Across the hall, she welcomed him with a warm smile, but her expression changed immediately when he mentioned the nocturnal noises coming from the neighboring apartment. A veil of worry crossed her wrinkled face, and she murmured something about apartment 6B before hurrying toward the stairs. Thomas remained perplexed by this strange reaction, wondering what could trouble his neighbor to this extent. He decided to inspect the hallway of his floor to identify precisely which apartment was adjacent to his. Leaving his home, Thomas carefully examined the door numbering. His apartment bore the number 6A. Unlogically, the adjacent apartment should be 6B, however. Heading toward the end of the hallway, he noted with surprise that it ended with a blank wall covered with yellowish wallpaper. There was no door bearing the number 6B, only this mysterious wall that seemed to be an integral part of the building's architecture. Thomas touched the rough surface of the wall, noting its apparent solidity and the absence of any trace of a former opening. Intrigued by this architectural anomaly, Thomas went down to see Mr. Garnier in his cramped lodge located on the ground floor. The concierge was sorting mail with mechanical and precise gestures, his gnarled hands manipulating envelopes with surprising dexterity for his age. When Thomas explained his confusion regarding the apartment numbering, Mr. Garnier's face froze imperceptibly. He raised his tired eyes to Thomas and declared in a neutral voice that no apartment 6B existed in the building. According to him, the 5th floor hallway indeed ended with a solid wall since the building's construction. This rational explanation should have reassured Thomas, but it only deepened his trouble. No apartment existed on the other side of his partition. Where did these nocturnal murmurs that had kept him awake come from? He went back upstairs with a feeling of growing unease, wondering if he wasn't the victim of an auditory hallucination or an inexplicable acoustic phenomenon. Perhaps the sounds came from another apartment and propagated through the pipes or the building's very structure. This logical hypothesis temporarily soothed him until night fell again. Around 22 hours, The murmurs resumed with an even more marked intensity than the previous evening. Thomas got up from his couch and approached the problematic partition. His ear turned toward these enigmatic sounds. This time, he seemed to perceive distinct words in the middle of this incomprehensible litany. Fragments of sentences in French sometimes emerged from this continuous verbal flow, but their meaning completely escaped him. There was something pleading in this voice, like a prayer or supplication addressed to an invisible entity. Thomas decided to knock 3 sharp blows against the wall, hoping to attract the attention of his mysterious neighbor. Silence fell instantly. On the other side of the partition, as if his presence had just been detected, then, after a few seconds of agonizing wait, 3 identical knocks resonated in response, perfectly synchronized with those he had just given. Thomas's heart accelerated brutally, and cold sweat beaded on his forehead. Someone or something had indeed just answered him from a place that was supposed to be nothing but a solid wall. This troubling revelation has completely disrupted Thomas's perception of his environment. How is it possible for a presence to manifest in a space that didn't officially exist? He knocked again, this time with 4 rapid blows, and obtained exactly the same sequence in return. The entity or person on the other side seemed perfectly aware of his presence and capable of interacting with him. Thomas remained frozen before this wall, oscillating between fascination and pure terror. The following days took an increasingly obsessive turn for Thomas. Each evening, he waited with growing anxiety for the appearance of the mysterious murmurs. And each night, he spent hours communicating by knocks with his invisible neighbor. A rudimentary code gradually established itself between them. 1 knock for yes, 2 knocks for no, 3 knocks to attract attention. This primitive but real communication reinforced Thomas's conviction that he wasn't going crazy. There was indeed someone on the other side of this impossible wall, my dear listeners. If this story fascinates you as much as it thrills me to tell it to you, I know you'll stay until the end to discover the terrible secret of apartment 6B, because what Thomas is about to discover will exceed all your darkest expectations. Thomas undertook thorough research on the history of his building, scouring municipal archives and questioning former residents. He discovered that the building had undergone several modifications over the decades, the renovations that had sometimes altered the apartment distribution. In the original plans from 1923, he indeed found traces of an apartment, 6B, perfectly identical to his in terms of area and configuration. According to the archives, this apartment had been inhabited until 1983, then mysteriously struck from the registers without any official explanation being provided. The last recorded tenant was one Pierre Moreau, a 35-year-old man whose trace was completely lost after this date. This discovery electrified Thomas, who understood he might hold the key to this architectural mystery. Went to the municipal archives to deepen his research on Pierre Moreau and the circumstances of his disappearance. The City Hall employees, initially reluctant to dig through such old files, finally provided him with some troubling elements. Pierre Moreau had been reported missing in October 1983. After his neighbors had reported suspicious odors coming from his apartment, when authorities had forced the lock, the apartment was empty, without trace of struggle or break-in, as if its occupant had vanished into thin air. The police investigation of the time had concluded with voluntary disappearance, Pierre Moreau being riddled with debts and in the process of divorce. However, some neighbor testimonies reported strange noises and disturbing behaviors in the weeks preceding his disappearance. Several residents had reported incessant murmurs from apartment 6B, as well as repeated knocks against the walls. At unusual hours, Thomas felt an icy shiver run down his spine, reading these testimonies that corresponded exactly to his own experience. He was experiencing the exact repetition of events that had occurred 40 years earlier. Armed with this troubling information, Thomas returned to see Mr. Garnier, determined to obtain more precise answers. This time, he directly approached the subject of apartment 6B and Pierre Moreau's disappearance. The concierge's face literally decomposed, and his hands began to tremble uncontrollably. After a long silence, The old man finally confessed that he had witnessed the events of 1983 and that he had kept this terrible secret for all these years. According to him, apartment 6B had been walled up by order of the condominium, officially for structural safety reasons, but in reality to stop the unexplained phenomena occurring there. Mr. Garnier revealed that Pierre Moreau had become increasingly strange in the months preceding his disappearance, claiming to communicate with invisible entities and spending his nights murmuring incomprehensible incantations. Had complained about the noise disturbances, but also about an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to emanate from apartment 6B, some reported recurring nightmares, sensations of malevolent presence, and even fleeting apparitions in the hallways. The situation had become so unbearable that several families had left the building, unable to bear this deleterious atmosphere. Pierre Moreau's disappearance had been perceived as a deliverance by most residents. However, the paranormal phenomena hadn't ceased with Pierre Moreau's departure. On the contrary, they had intensified, as if his physical absence had freed even more powerful forces. The new tenants of apartment 6A, the one Thomas now occupied, had all reported similar experiences: nocturnal murmurs, knocks in the walls, sensations of invisible presence. None of them had lasted more than a few months. Before moving out hastily, invoking professional or family pretexts to justify their departure, Thomas was the 16th tenant to occupy this apartment since the walling up of apartment 6B, and all his predecessors had fled under similar circumstances. This shocking revelation explained why the rent was so affordable and why the real estate agent had seemed so eager to conclude the transaction. Thomas understood that he had unwittingly become the guinea pig of an experiment that had been repeating relentlessly for 40 years. Each new tenant of apartment 6A became the target of these supernatural manifestations, as if something or someone was desperately seeking to establish contact from the other side of the wall. The question that now haunted Thomas was whether he was communicating with Pierre Moreau's spirit or with a much older and more malevolent entity. He decided to push his investigations further, despite Mr. Garnier's increasingly pressing warnings. Dear subscribers, if you want to discover the continuation of this terrifying story and know the fate reserved for Thomas, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and activate the little notification bell, because your support gives me the necessary strength to continue offering you these blood-chilling tales. And also think about consulting the link in the description. To participate in our exclusive contests, reserved for our community of horror enthusiasts, Thomas decided to conduct his own thorough investigation in apartment 6A, searching for clues that his predecessors might have left behind. By meticulously inspecting every corner, he discovered carved inscriptions in the wood of his closets, desperate messages left by former tenants. Some had tried to document their experiences, scribbling dates and descriptions of paranormal phenomena on walls hidden behind furniture. Others had left explicit warnings. Don't answer the knocks. Don't listen to the murmurs. Leave before it's too late. These pathetic testimonies revealed the extent of trauma experienced by his predecessors and their inability to escape the grip of these mysterious forces. One of these carved messages mentioned the existence of a journal hidden somewhere in the C apartment, and by a tenant who had tried to pierce the mystery of apartment 6B. Thomas frantically searched every possible hiding place, moving furniture and lifting floorboards in search of this crucial testimony. He finally discovered a yellowed notebook hidden behind the bedroom radiator, protected by a plastic bag that had preserved it from humidity. The handwritten text was that of Marie Dubois, a former tenant who had occupied apartment 6A for 3 months in 1995. Her journal detailed day by day the evolution of the paranormal phenomena and her desperate attempts to understand their origin. Marie Dubois had also begun by hearing nocturnal murmurs and had established a communication system by knocks with the invisible entity. But over the weeks, the manifestations had intensified worryingly, surpassing the simple auditory framework to invade her daily reality. She reported unexplained temperature variations in the apartment, with areas of glacial cold that moved without apparent logic. Objects began to move slightly from their initial position, as if an invisible presence was seeking to mark its territory. Marie had also noted the appearance of humidity stains on the adjoining wall, brownish halos that seemed to ooze from between the stones despite the absence of any pipe leak. The journal revealed that Marie Dubois had tried to pierce the wall, separating the two apartments, obsessed by the need to discover what was hiding on the other side. Armed with a hammer and chisel, she had begun to dig discreetly in the partition, working at night to avoid attracting the neighbors' attention. But the more she delved into the wall, the more the paranormal phenomena amplified, as if her intrusion. Deeply disturbed the entity residing in apartment 6B, the murmurs transformed into plaintive moans, then into veritable cries of distress that woke her with a start several times per night. Marie's growing terror showed through in her last entries, where she expressed her conviction that something was seeking to possess her or drag her to the other side of the wall. The journal's last entry, dated November 28, 1990. 5 was particularly troubling. I managed to pierce the wall tonight. There is indeed a space on the other side, but what I saw there exceeds all understanding. Pierre Moreau is still there, but he's no longer truly human. He saw me and smiled, and now I know he'll never let me leave. If someone finds this journal, let them flee immediately and never seek to communicate with him. Thomas felt his hands tremble reading these last words. Understanding that Marie Dubois had also mysteriously disappeared after discovering the terrible secret of apartment 6B, her fate was probably identical to that of Pierre Moreau and all those who had been unfortunate enough to establish contact with this malevolent entity. Asterisk. Despite the explicit warnings contained in the journal, Thomas felt irresistibly attracted to the mystery of apartment 6B. A compulsive force pushed him to pursue the research undertaken by Marie Dubois and to pierce the wall that separated the two worlds himself. He easily located the place where she had begun to dig, hidden behind a massive wardrobe that she had pushed against the wall to mask her activities. The hole wasn't very deep, barely fist-sized, but Thomas could feel a cold air current escaping from it, confirming the existence of a hollow space on the other side. A nauseating odor also emerged from this opening, a mixture of mold, rot, and something indefinable that turned his stomach. Thomas decided to resume the undermining work undertaken by Marie Dubois, driven by a curiosity that far exceeded his fear. Each night, after 23 hours, he armed himself with DIY tools and methodically dug in the thick partition. Progressing centimeter by centimeter toward apartment 6B, the murmurs from the other side intensified as he approached, as if the invisible entity approved his efforts or encouraged him to continue. Sometimes Thomas had the impression of hearing words of encouragement in this incomprehensible litany, sentence fragments that seemed specifically intended to motivate him. This troubling complicity between him and the entity reinforced his determination. Despite the growing terror that seized him at each digging session, after a week of sustained effort, Thomas succeeded in completely piercing the partition, creating an opening large enough to pass his head through. On the other side, he indeed discovered an identical apartment to his, but plunged in total darkness and frozen in an advanced state of decay. The air was unbreathable, charged with sticky humidity that clung to the lungs and putrid effluvia that assaulted the nostrils. Thomas shined his flashlight into the space, revealing mold-covered walls, a ceiling crumbling in entire patches, and furniture remnants gnawed by time and humidity. But what froze him with horror was the human silhouette, sitting in an armchair in the center of the main room. Pierre Moreau was indeed still there, exactly as Marie Dubois had described in her journal. But 40 years of confinement in this unhealthy environment had transformed the man into a monstrous creature that no longer had much human about it. His skin had become translucent and traversed by blackish veins. His hair had grown anarchically to form a hirsute mass that fell on his shoulders. His decomposed clothes hung in tatters on his emaciated body, and his nails had grown to become veritable, curved and yellowish claws. But the most terrifying thing was his eyes. 2 hollow sockets that shone with phosphorescent light in the darkness, fixing Thomas with hypnotic intensity. When Pierre Moreau became aware of Thomas's presence, a hideous smile deformed his decomposed features, revealing blackened teeth and purulent gums. He slowly rose from his armchair with jerky movements, like a puppet manipulated by invisible strings, and headed toward the opening Thomas had just created. His voice, when he began to speak, was the one Thomas had been hearing for weeks through. The partition, but deformed by decades of isolation and progressive madness. Finally, he murmured in a tone both grateful and threatening, "Someone else will be able to take my place in this eternal prison." Thomas then understood with horror that Marie Dubois hadn't merely discovered apartment 6B, she had entered it and never come out. Asterisk. In a corner of the cursed apartment, Thomas indeed glimpsed the remains of Marie Dubois, or at least what she had become after decades of imprisonment in this hell. She too had undergone the same monstrous transformation as Pierre Moreau, becoming a creature halfway between human and specter. Her gaze met Thomas's through the opening, and she silently mouthed the word "flee" before Pierre Moreau brutally pushed her out of his field of vision. Thomas realized that all the former tenants of apartment 6A who had mysteriously disappeared had probably become prisoners of this cursed space. He had just understood the diabolical mechanism that had been repeating relentlessly for 40 years, attracting victims one by one into this deadly trap. The absolute terror that seized Thomas paralyzed him for several crucial seconds, making him lose the advantage of surprise. Pierre Moreau had approached close enough to the opening to try to slip through it, his skeletal arms gripping the edges of the hole to hoist himself toward apartment 6A. Thomas retreated precipitously, knocking over his DIY equipment in a metallic crash that resonated in the nocturnal silence of the building. He ran toward his entrance door, but Pierre Moreau had managed to pass partially through the opening and was now pursuing him in his own apartment. The creature moved with surprising agility, despite its state of decomposition, its claws clicking. On the parquet, as it tried to catch its prey, Thomas managed to reach his door and slammed it behind him, but he knew this respite would only be temporary. Pierre Moreau knew the apartment configuration perfectly and would soon find a way to join him in the hallway. He rushed down the stairs 4 at a time, hoping to alert the other residents and find help to escape his supernatural pursuer. But when he pounded on his neighbors' doors, no one answered, as if the entire building was plunged in artificial sleep or a form of collective trance. Only Mr. Garnier emerged from his lodge, his face deformed by an expression of terror that confirmed he knew exactly what was happening. "I warned you," stammered the elderly concierge, his hands trembling uncontrollably. "Now it's too late. You've freed Pierre Moreau and all the others. They're going to invade the entire building until they find new victims to replace them." Thomas understood that Mr. Garnier had been complicit in this situation from the beginning, deliberately attracting new tenants to feed the insatiable appetite of the creatures. Imprisoned in apartment 6B, the concierge revealed that he himself had been under the grip of these entities for 40 years, forced to regularly provide them with fresh flesh to prevent them from definitively escaping their prison. Each new tenant of apartment 6A was an offering, intended to temporarily calm their thirst for freedom and revenge. The building's lights began to flicker erratically, creating an atmosphere of waking nightmare where shadows danced on the walls like living entities. Thomas now heard multiple footsteps on the upper floors, confirming that several creatures had managed to escape their secular prison. The murmurs he knew so well transformed into veritable howls of rage and frustration, resonating throughout the building's structure. Mr. Garnier collapsed on a chair, aged several years in the space of a few minutes, murmuring pathetic apologies for his complicity in this horror. He explained that Pierre Moreau wasn't the first victim of apartment 6B, but simply the most recent guardian of a much older evil. The building had been constructed on the site of a former psychiatric asylum destroyed in a fire in 1921. The current foundations rested directly on the former isolation room where the most dangerous patients were confined. The architects of the time had deliberately masked this history, but they couldn't prevent the negative energies accumulated for decades from rising to the surface. Apartment 6B had been designed as a threshold between the world of the living and that of the dead, a crossing point where tormented spirits could easily manifest. Pierre Moreau had been the first to establish direct contact with these entities, but instead of appeasing them, he had become their servant and their jailer. His physical disappearance had actually marked his transformation into eternal guardian of this spiritual prison. Thomas understood that each tenant of apartment 6A was destined to replace one of the prisoners on the other side, thus maintaining the fragile balance that prevented these creatures from spreading into the outside world. Marie Dubois and all the others had been attracted by the same morbid curiosity as him, manipulated by the murmurs and knocks so they would pierce the wall of their prison themselves. By freeing the creatures, Thomas had broken a cycle that had lasted for more than 40 years and triggered a catastrophe whose scope he couldn't even imagine. The howls were now approaching the ground floor, accompanied by incessant scratching against walls and doors, as if a pack of predators was desperately seeking an exit. The building's temperature was dropping rapidly. Thomas could see his breath condensing in the glacial air that was progressively invading all spaces. A pestilential odor spread through the hallways, a mixture of decomposing flesh and sulfur that caught in the throat and caused uncontrollable nausea. Thomas realized that the building's other residents were probably already dead or transformed, which explained the total absence of reaction to his calls for help. The creatures had had time to spread throughout the entire building while he was discussing with Mr. Garnier, contaminating each apartment with their malevolent presence. The concierge confirmed his fears by revealing that the entities possessed the ability to temporarily possess the living, transforming them into conscious but powerless puppets. All the residents were now under the grip of these supernatural forces. Waiting for Thomas to come join them in their new, nightmarish existence, Thomas headed toward the building's main exit. But the entrance door refused to open despite all his efforts. The locks seemed to have welded themselves, and even the windows resisted his attempts to break them with supernatural solidity. He was prisoner of this cursed building, exactly like all previous victims had been. The creatures had taken total control of the environment, manipulating physical reality to prevent any escape. Thomas understood he no longer had any choice but to directly confront Pierre Moreau and his companions in misfortune. He slowly went back up to his apartment, guided by the maws and murmurs that now resonated throughout the building. Each floor he climbed seemed more oppressive than the previous one, the air becoming denser and harder to breathe. The walls themselves seemed alive, pulsing slightly, as if traversed by a gigantic circulatory system. Humidity stains appeared and disappeared before his eyes, sometimes forming tortured faces that seemed to silently plead with him. Thomas had the impression of penetrating the entrails of a living organism rather than climbing a normal building. Arriving in front of his door, Thomas found it was wide open and that a greenish light was escaping from his apartment. Pierre Moreau was waiting for him patiently, sitting in Thomas's armchair as if he were at home. Marie Dubois stood beside him, as well as several other silhouettes that Thomas didn't recognize, but who were probably former transformed tenants. All of them fixed him with that same phosphorescent glow in their eyes, and their faces expressed a mixture of compassion and implacable determination. "Welcome to our family," murmured Pierre Moreau, in a voice that seemed to come from several throats simultaneously. Thomas understood he no longer had any means of escaping his destiny, but a last glimmer of hope lit up in his mind. If these creatures needed replacements to maintain balance, this perhaps meant they were bound to specific rules he could exploit. He remembered the research he had conducted on the former psychiatric asylum and the methods used at the time to contain violent patients. Perhaps there existed a way to definitively close this door between worlds and free both the living and the dead from this curse. Thomas decided to play everything and propose a deal to Pierre Moreau. "If I voluntarily take your place," declared Thomas in a voice he hoped was firm despite his terror. "Will you accept to free all the other prisoners and definitively seal apartment 6B? Pierre Moreau slowly inclined his head, seeming to reflect on this unexpected proposition. The other creatures exchanged glances, communicating through a form of telepathy that Thomas couldn't intercept. After a long moment of silent deliberation, Pierre Moreau nodded and extended his skeletal hand toward Thomas. "Deal concluded," he murmured, "but know that your sacrifice cannot completely cancel the curse. Only postpone it to the next innocent who will be attracted here. Thomas shook Pierre Moreau's icy hand, immediately feeling glacial energy climb up his arm. His vision gradually blurred, and he had the impression that his soul was slowly detaching from his physical body. The creatures surrounding him began to gradually regain their human appearance, as if Thomas's vital energy allowed them to temporarily recover their lost humanity. Marie Dubois addressed him with a grateful smile before vanishing in golden mist, finally freed from her eternal prison. One by one, all the prisoners of apartment 6B disappeared in this same light, returning to the eternal rest that had been refused them for so long. Thomas found himself alone with Pierre Moreau, who had also begun his final transformation. The man was gradually becoming again who he had been 40 years earlier, his features refining and his skin regaining normal color. "Thank you," he murmured, before disappearing in his turn in the golden light, leaving Thomas alone in apartment 6A. But Thomas knew he was no longer really Thomas. He had become the new guardian of this spiritual prison, condemned to wait for the next tenant who would succumb to curiosity. He settled in Pierre Moreau's still warm armchair and began to murmur the incantations that would maintain the balance between worlds. The following days, Mr. Garnier discreetly cleaned apartment 6A and put it back on the rental market. With the same attractive rent as usual, the real estate agent quickly received several applications from young people attracted by this bargain in the Parisian market. Thomas, from his new state of existence, observed these future victims with a mixture of compassion and resignation. He knew he would soon have to restart the same process of seduction and manipulation that had led to his own downfall. The nocturnal murmurs would resume, the knocks in the wall would resonate again, and a new innocent would discover the existence of apartment 6B. A month later, Sophie Martineau, a 24-year-old art student, signed the lease for apartment 6A with the same enthusiasm Thomas had felt. She moved in with her brushes and canvases, dreaming of creating works inspired by the authentic atmosphere of this old building. The first evening, around 23 hours, she heard strange murmurs coming from the partition that separated her living room from the neighboring apartment. At first, Sophie thought it was simply a neighbor watching television or talking on the phone, a classic noise nuisance of apartment building life. But as the minutes passed, she realized that these persistent murmurs had something unusual about them, something that fascinated her despite herself. From the other side of the wall, Thomas observed his new victim with the same painful compassion he had felt toward all his predecessors. He knew he had no choice, that the curse forced him to attract Sophie toward her fatal destiny. The rules were immutable. He had to create enough curiosity for her to pierce the wall of her own volition. So Thomas began to murmur, his words lost in the thickness of the partition, but nevertheless reaching the sensitive ears of the young artist. And somewhere in the building, Mr. Garnier smiled sadly while counting the days remaining before having to clean apartment 6A again. The story of apartment 6B was far from over, because some curses are eternal and pass from victim to victim without ever knowing a true end. In the dark depths of our modern cities, there still exist cursed places where reality bends to the will of entities that refuse to leave our world. And sometimes, when you hear inexplicable murmurs behind your walls, it's better not to seek to know who is speaking to you in the shadows. Because certain doors should never be opened, and certain mysteries only ask to devour those who approach them too closely. Apartment 6B may be waiting for you somewhere in your building. It's behind a wall that doesn't officially exist, but secretly pulses to the rhythm of your heart.